Hello and welcome to another uh, PowerPoint lecture thingy. This is intended for my students from Anglo-American University who are taking my Comparative Worldviews class. But if you're not from AAU and you're not in my Comparative Worldviews class, welcome anyway. We're going to spend this time talking about Theistic Existentialism, and this is something that we typically don't have time for if I were to lecture on it in class, but I think it's important because this is where existentialism comes from. You will notice that Nietzsche is sometimes noted as an early existentialist, but even more so, even more impactful on existentialism in particular is Kierkegaard, and we're going to be talking a lot about Kierkegaard. But to sort of introduce you to the mood of existentialism, check out this poem. It's called Invictus by William Ernest Henley, and I think at one point British school children learned this by heart. Anyway, it goes like this. Out of the night that covers me, black as a pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, that, in other words, death. And yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And that kind of really heavy emphasis on autonomy and willpower is sort of a hallmark of existentialism, although William Ernest Henley wrote this way before existentialism was really a widespread philosophy. So existentialism is essentially a way of trying to find meaning in an otherwise absurd universe through an intense subjective willing, a passionate choosing, though not this kind of passionate choosing that you get in a romance novel. I think it's more like this kind of passionate choosing where you're sitting down and trying to figure out which way your life's journey is going to go. There are two types of existentialism, of course. There is theistic and atheistic existentialism. That is, theistic comes from Jewish or Christian thought, and atheistic doesn't. Soren Kierkegaard is considered the OG existentialist. He's the one that really got the existentialist ball rolling. So let's talk about his life and his ideas, and then we'll discuss some later theistic existentialists. So for his biography, he was born in 1813 in Copenhagen. His mother had been a servant and his father had grown up a peasant in Jutland before coming to Copenhagen and making his fortune. Kierkegaard was the youngest of 11 children. I'm sorry, not 11, 7. I got 7-11 stuck in my brain, I guess. Youngest of 7 children. He was physically weak as a child, but very, very clever. During his youth, he spent his time going to parties where he was witty and fun to be with, but inside he was very depressed and looking for meaning. There's a reason why he is known popularly as the melancholy Dane. During his university years, his teachers stressed the conflict between orthodoxy, that is what we studied as Christian theism, and rationalism, what we studied as Enlightenment deism. Kierkegaard felt he didn't fit well into either camp. Through the encouragement of another of his professors, he started looking into Romanticism and other philosophical systems to try to find answers to his deep questions. He became fascinated with the system of G.W.F. Hegel, and we don't have time to go into Hegel in any depth, but basically it's how all of history was coming to an end point where the slumbering universal spirit was going to awaken into self-consciousness, all that was. It's a very pantheistic sort of idea. Later, Kierkegaard would violently reject Hegelianism. In 1835, he felt that his life was going nowhere. It had been a difficult time between 1832 and 1834. The family had lost 3 children, and Kierkegaard's mother had died. He was bored by his theological studies. Orthodoxy seemed to be outmoded, kind of static, but he didn't really care for the rationalistic, deistic theology either. His father had done his best to bring him up in a Christian home as a Christian, and he became concerned about his son and sent him away to a small fishing village called Galileia to give Kierkegaard some time away from it all. The contact with nature clarified things for Kierkegaard. He realized that he didn't actually know why he was alive. He didn't really have a reason for living. Objective truth could not tell him that. He decided that what he needed was one solid thing, one thing that would be true for him, something he could live for and die for. The inscription on the memorial stone comes from the same journal entry where he discusses all of this. I am going to crucify the Danish because I do not know Danish, but Vad sandhed andet and in leven for an idea. What is truth if not living for an idea? And then from the same journal entry, what I really lack is to be clear in my mind what I am to do, not what I am to know. The thing is to understand myself, to see what God really wishes me to do. The thing is to find a truth which is true for me, to find the idea for which I can live and die. He didn't, now you could think, because we're 21st century, you know, everybody's talking about truth for me, what's true for me, what's true for you. He didn't just want some subjective experience. He wanted some immediate intuitive experience of reality that transcended the bounds of objective and subjective. Something that somehow goes beyond both. And that is what existentialism strives for. Returning from that trip, he discovered something about his father that affected him deeply. His father had passed on to Kierkegaard a deep belief in an all-seeing God who it is our duty to obey, but also who we can trust with our whole lives. But Michael, his father, Michael Kierkegaard, was a melancholy man and was haunted by his own conscience. When he was a young boy, the father, Michael, when herding sheep and was hungry and poor, had cursed God. He found out another thing about his father which shook him up. Michael's first wife died, bearing him no children. A year later, he married the maid, who bore him a son a few months later. Do the math. When Kierkegaard figured out that his father, this pious, hard-working old man, should have so fallen sexually, it shook him up a great deal. This and other questions he had been struggling with led him to a crisis in his Christian faith. He started spending more and more time in coffee houses than in his studies. He ran up huge bills that his father sometimes had to pay. He and his father became alienated. Kierkegaard, at this point in his life, was pursuing what he would later call the aesthetic attitude of the Romantics, trying to find this childlike immediate grasp of what's true through pursuing experiences. But that only led him to further boredom and deeper melancholy. He began what he saw later as the road of repentance, back to the Christian faith. But he now saw that it couldn't just be Christianity as a set of general truths, but it had to be something that was inward, an inward relationship with Christ. In 1838, he reconciled with his father. It seemed as though his father had made the first move, perhaps revealing something else about his life that he thought would be helpful to his son. Kierkegaard's reaction to this was one of experiencing a breakthrough of joy. He felt not only reconciled to his father, but also ready to actually become a Christian. His father died a few months later. Another incident that shook up Kierkegaard pretty terribly was his broken engagement to Regina Olsen. He met her when she was just 14 in 1837, and it was love at first sight. And no, Kierkegaard was not a creeper. It was he didn't do anything or propose. They were friends, but it was not unusual for young women, even that early, to have suitors. Regina seemed fresh and innocent, alive, immediate, everything that Kierkegaard was not. All the things Kierkegaard desired but seemed inaccessible to him because of his melancholy, because of the way his brain overanalyzed everything. 3 years later, they were engaged to be married, but he broke off the engagement after a year despite her protests because he too carried a secret. Once, during his student days, when he'd been drunk, he allowed himself to get carried away and had slept with a prostitute. He feared that revealing that secret would destroy her and their relationship. But on the other hand, he could not marry her without telling her everything. He had to be honest with his wife. He had to be absolutely honest or not have the relationship. So he broke it off without telling her why, which was very hard for him and for her. It caused something of a scandal in society, because it left her in a kind of a vulnerable position. But he thought that perhaps it meant that he could be more devoted, more singularly focused on God. She eventually married another man, no surprise, and that hurt Kierkegaard a great deal. He passed his theological exam. He wrote many books, mostly under pseudonyms. We know that these are his books because he told us in another essay called My Point of View as an Author. He used pen names to distance himself from his works and to discourage anyone who would wish to systematize his perspective. He harshly criticized the Danish Lutheran Church, which he thought had become so formalized that it became dead. While still carrying on this debate with the Lutheran Church, he collapsed. When physicians came to see him, he told them there was nothing they could do. His was a spiritual sickness. He died quite young, in his 40s, but he left about as many books as he had years. Terrifically prolific. Students caused a riot at his funeral to protest the fact that the Danish Lutheran Church, which Kierkegaard had so harshly critiqued, was now in the act of burying him. And hear me, my students, if I have told you that you should do the reading questions from Fear and Trembling, you should pause this. This video now and actually do the reading questions. But if I have not told you, then by all means, keep going. But Fear and Trembling was the work that Kierkegaard considered his very best, and became an inspiration even to Jean-Paul Sartre, as we shall see in the next video. All right, so the Fear and Trembling, the central idea of Fear and Trembling is the idea of the night of faith, which we need to put in context by looking at the ideas that Kierkegaard was wrestling with. Philosophically, when he was at university, Kierkegaard had kind of come into his own, learning and trying to master the incredibly complex Hegelian system. For Hegel, all of history describes a single process of universal reason coming to self-consciousness. The unveiling of absolute spirit. It's a kind of a pantheistic idea of kind of the universe is God, and at some point we will reach a point where a utopia where the universe achieves self-consciousness. Everything fits into the system. Even things that didn't seem to fit were all made to serve what Hegel called the cunning of reason. And universal spirit, universal reason, they're basically the same thing. In other words, they all served this universal spirit that was in the process of coming to self-consciousness. But that could only be seen in retrospect. And here Hegel draws upon the image of the owl of Minerva, which Greeks used as a kind of a metaphor for history. The owl looks back over its shoulder and sees how things make sense. The owl, and Hegel said, the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only at the falling of dusk. Hegel's universal system was the reigning cutting-edge philosophy that everybody was talking about. And Kierkegaard started out fascinated by this philosophical system, how it seemed to have all the answers. Everything was tied up in Hegel. But the more Kierkegaard learned about it, the less he liked it. He grew to hate it. It became his bête noire, his black beast, his mortal enemy. That's part of the reason why he talks in the reading about the universal so much. That's his digs. Those are his digs at Hegel. What didn't he like about it? He believed that trying to capture all of reality in this grand sweep of some universal dialectical process forgot one very, very important thing: the individual. The individual became lost and swept away in the great tide of history. And for Kierkegaard, that was unacceptable. Theologically, Kierkegaard had grown up in the Danish Lutheran Church. At the time, the church was very orthodox. It believed all the right things, but it seemed to him also to be very dead. Church was all about being respectable, about doing what others expected of you. It became a way of being socially acceptable and palatable. But to Kierkegaard, real faith isn't about respectability or about believing the correct things, but it's about putting oneself into an absolute relationship with the absolute, into an absolute relationship with the finite, the infinite, with the eternal, with the transcendent God. To use the language of 20th century Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, Kierkegaard believed that the church had turned the Christian's relationship with God from being an I-you relationship to an I-it relationship. I'll explain that a little more. Such a relationship with the infinite, Kierkegaard said, would have to be a shattering experience. So Kierkegaard saw it as his duty to jolt the church back into life, back into faith. And that's what he wrote about principally. Some of his more important ideas: truth is subjective. One of the reasons he resisted the totalizing system of Hegel was that it overlooked the individuality of the people who lived within the system. And if you listen really carefully, you can hear the echoes of Romanticism. For Hegel and Hamann and all those guys, right? For Hegel and for most of the philosophers after Descartes, truth was simply an objective reality. The image that Kierkegaard used to represent this understanding of objective truth was a judge. What does a judge do? A judge hears both sides. He hears from the plaintiff, he hears from the defendant, and then he carefully sifts and weighs both sides and arrives at a decision. And what do we value in judges? We value impartiality, distance, non-involvement, being unbiased. That's how philosophers approached the idea of truth after Descartes, all of them as unbiased judges, as observers. But Kierkegaard said there was another way, a way that fit better with the way people actually lived, the way of the participant. The reality of what it means to be human is to love, sweat, weep, and struggle with meaning, to struggle with our choices. Because every time we choose one thing, we are always excluding all other options. And that leads us to what Kierkegaard called the agony or the angst of decision. Real flesh and blood human beings, for real flesh and blood human beings, a dispassionate judging is a betrayal of the nature of truth, and it does nothing to help those in the throes of the struggle of life itself. For them, what is needed is a passionate commitment to the truth, an inward conviction that consumes their whole being. Nothing else will satisfy. Now, does that mean that Kierkegaard, like the Romantics, believed that any passion will do? Passion for nature, passion for a woman or a man or for a cause? No. He believed that only a passionate commitment to something infinite, contact with absolute reality, would cure the human predicament, not by giving us rest and peace and ceasing from struggle, but by giving us life and absolute relationship, something absolutely real with a capital R to struggle for. And only the religious answer deals in the infinite. Only God can give us the cure to what's ailing us. And so Kierkegaard's existentialism is markedly different from Romanticism. Another important idea, how God enters time. If God is the solution, then how is it possible that we, being creatures who are trapped in time, finite, temporal beings, how is it possible for us to come into a relationship with an infinite, eternal being? Or to use Kierkegaard's language, how can we enter into an absolute relationship with the absolute? And that second absolute is a capital A because it's God. How is it possible for an infinite, eternal God to enter into finite time, as Christianity claims that God entered into time in Christ? Now you got to understand what Kierkegaard is asking. The way he's posing this problem, he sees time, time-bound finite existence as being qualitatively different than the eternal and absolute, the infinite. The two categories are an infinite distance apart. It's a chasm of an infinite distance. How can this infinite distance be bridged? Is God necessarily forever out of reach? No. The way this infinite chasm can be bridged is through only one way, the absurd paradox That is an event that shatters temporal finite categories. And therein lies God's divinity, his transcendence, the infinite, the eternal. God can appear in our finite temporal world only by way of paradox. So when Christ appeared, when God entered into time, it had to be by a way that was hidden, or what Kierkegaard called the incognito, a paradoxical situation in which Christ appeared to be merely a finite man, but in reality, he was infinite. When we come to Christ, the finite man, we are put in touch with the hidden infinite by way of paradox. In other words, there are no rational categories or proofs that can adequately justify faith in Christ. It must be done on the basis of faith alone. So faith, for Kierkegaard, then, is the opposite of reason. It is a risk-filled, passionate embrace of God through paradox. Any attempt at making the Christian faith reasonable is seen by Kierkegaard as stripping it of divine power and evaporating faith. For Kierkegaard, faith, if Christianity becomes understandable, if it doesn't break our logic, if the Christian faith is made reasonable, then it becomes merely a thing of this world, and it does not require faith to believe in. It merely requires rational assent, rational agreement. The kind of, okay, that makes sense. And that makes sense for Kierkegaard is absolutely not faith. Real faith goes against logic. It transcends rational temporal categories and passionately chooses the absolute through paradox, or what Kierkegaard calls the night of faith. It is precisely its irrationality, its paradoxical nature that makes faith faith. Hence Kierkegaard's famous phrase, the leap of faith. Hope that guy's going to be okay. Or was okay. He looks like he's from the 50s. Anyway, that's the leap of faith. Okay, a couple of other ideas and works that are helpful for understanding Kierkegaard's perspective are the books called Either Or and Stages on Life's Way. These are very complex works, and we don't have time to go real deep into them. We're going to take sort of a bird's eye view of them, but to oversimplify, it shows that the different approaches to existence one might take during life. Each stage has its own center of gravity and its own boundary that you hit up against before you move to the next stage. Though it is, Kierkegaard said, possible to vacillate, to move back and forth between stages. So in these two books, he lays out three stages. The first is the aesthetic stage. In the aesthetic, which is sort of his interpretation of romanticism, one lives for experiences, for pleasures, for trying to recapture the elusive immediacy of childhood by focusing outward on things that you can be absorbed by, things you can be enraptured by, things that taste good and feel good and make you feel alive and exciting. And in the book, in Either Or, Kierkegaard personifies the aesthetic by the figures of drunken revelers at a party discoursing on love and seduction. But, importantly, the aesthetic stage has a border, irony, where everything kind of feels distant, even as you're pursuing immediacy. and a boredom that detaches and distances. You kind of end up, even as you're trying to get all of what life has to offer, you end up holding life at arm's length. And if you're just into pleasure and just kind of wanting all these experiences, you could stay there. But this really bothers self-aware, reflective people. He describes this situation of boredom like this. I don't feel like doing anything. I don't feel like riding. It's too much agitation. I don't feel like walking. It's too tiring. I don't feel like lying down because I'd either have to remain there, and I don't feel like doing that, or I'd have to get up again, and I don't feel like doing that either. Summum summarum, in other words, to sum up everything, I don't feel like doing anything. Or another good example is what Marie Antoinette, this woman who lived a scandalous, wealthy life of a royal, said. She had tasted and tried everything that Paris had to offer, and at one point in her life, she just said, "Nothing tastes. Like it's all boring now." And that's a kind of despair, right? But that despair can be overcome by accepting the self as ethical, all about choosing the good, choosing to remain faithful, choosing to be oneself. This ethical stance, this stance of discipline and inward faithfulness, the stability of conventional life where one does one's duty, this stage is personified by Judge Wilhelm, the happily married man who is a pillar of the community. The ethical man is one who is committed, who stays at his post, who finds his place within the universal moral law, and so chooses to be himself, in Kierkegaard's words. But this stage too has a boundary. Humor. When one gets some perspective on all of your righteousness, on all of your holiness and stuff, all of your very, very serious moral effort, the wise people can only shake their heads and laugh. And from the ethical, one can push into the religious, starting with what he calls religion A, an ethical religion where man sets the conditions for the meeting between God and man. But as one begins to grasp the reality of God, there's confusion, even despair for those who really, really want to meet God. And for the reflective and those who are driven to connect with God, this leads to religion B, the religion where man doesn't create the conditions for the meeting, but God creates the condition for the meeting. Paradox, even scandal, in what Kierkegaard calls the teleological suspension of the ethical, where one goes against universal ethical norms to meet God's demand, that is, to meet God. And in being, and sorry, not being in time, in Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard uses the biblical story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, where God tells Abraham, "Go sacrifice your child that you've waited your whole life for, your only child, and so that I can know if you really trust me or not." And so Abraham goes off and gets to the place and ties up his son and is about to kill him when an angel comes down and says, "Abraham, stop. I know now that you truly trust God." And he provides a lamb for the offering. But that, like, you don't murder your child. That's sort of a universal. Unless God says, "You want to connect with me? you gotta. That's heavy stuff, right? Nobody else is going to understand what you're doing except for God. You can't possibly, even you won't know for sure. Anyway, so this path, which you must walk alone, it's a lonely, winding path where you're never sure of whether you're actually connecting with God. But this is the way that God calls you. This is personified by Kierkegaard as the knight of faith, who goes forward in fear and trembling. And it is here that one gets a second reflected immediacy, or what Kierkegaard calls an absolute relationship with the absolute. But instead of with the romantics, with the aesthetic attitude, trying to find it through things that are outside of yourself, this immediacy is sought through inwardness, through paradox that renders the knight absolutely alone with God. So for Kierkegaard, life itself is, for the reflective and the spiritually restless, a journey of increasing inwardness from the experiences and the pleasures of the aesthetic, through the steadfastness of the ethical, to the shattering paradox of the religious, especially religion B, where God meets us in time. All right, so that's Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is generally regarded as the father of existentialist philosophy, a philosophy which in modern times has tended to be atheistic on the whole, as we will see when we investigate Sartre. And spoiler alert, Sartre basically steals Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith idea, but he replaces God with nothingness. So the Knight of Faith is basically replaced with the Knight of Nothingness, or the Knight of having faith in nothingness, or something. But we'll do that in another video. But there have been those who followed in the steps of religious faith, Kierkegaard's true descendants, if you will, thinkers such as the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber and the French Christian dramatist and philosopher Gabriel Marcel. For both of these thinkers, life is inescapably relational. And this is interesting because Kierkegaard, although he wrote about Christian love for others and stuff like that, in his existentialist philosophy, he didn't really emphasize person-to-person relationship and community all that much. He instead focused on this intense individual inward relationship with God. So Martin Buber is most famous for his book I and Thou. And in it, he argued that humans relate to their world in two fundamentally different ways, the I-it and the I-thou. The I-it relationship is conceptual, analytical, where we treat the other as an object. The I-thou, by contrast, has no structure. It's all about mystery. It cannot be measured. It has no conceptual content. Rather, it is a pure confrontation with infinity and mystery, or what Buber calls a dialogue of being. This is the human way of relating to other humans, sometimes the way we relate to nature, and definitely the way we relate to God. Neither is better than the other, but Buber believed that modernity tended to reduce everything to the conceptual, to the analytical I-it relationship, and that impoverishes life, makes us poorer spiritually. Gabriel Marcel echoed many of these ideas. They were roughly contemporaries and almost certainly knew of each other's work. And Marcel, too, offered a critique of modern times. For Marcel, the main realities of human life are a sense of wonder at the world around us and a deep sense of its brokenness. Not simply that history contains broken events and tragedies, that there's brokenness here and there, but that there is something about the constitution of the world, the constitution of existence itself, that is somehow tragic and broken. And he calls this sense of life's wonder and brokenness exigencies. These are not simply emotions or feelings. They are rather a call to our being from the outside. But modern life tends to smother that sense of wonder and brokenness in despair by reducing life to technique. Things in this world become things for us to use, and we don't see their wonder. We don't see the wonder of the world. Life becomes a series of problems to solve, and we miss the sacredness and dignity of life. We believe that technology can solve everything, and we thereby drain the mystery out of life. And then, when we find life coming up short on meaning because we've drained it of meaning, we are then tempted to believe that we can autonomously create meaning and value for ourselves. But as we do that, we become unsure of our own existence, of what authentic existence actually means. Life becomes flat and existentially dull. Marcel uses the illustration of someone distributing metro tokens, right? You're just in this little box and you're giving out little tokens for the metro all day long. And he says at the beginning there's going to be frustration because it's like confining and it's boring and it's repetitive, but after a while you get used to it and it doesn't really bore you so much anymore. And he says, in this way, we too become insensible to the wonder and the brokenness of life. We become distanced from authentic experience. And this is especially true in relationships. Marcel wrote often about how modern life tends to evaporate our sense of what he called the mystery of the other. Like, take communication. Communication is a mystery that we take for granted day after day after day. How is it possible that I can give someone else part of who I am and they can give me part of who they are, that we can share in each other's presence through something as seemingly trivial as words? But in modernity, in modernism, we tend to treat others as disposable, usable, an object, because we forget the depth of the mystery that we confront in dealing with another human being. And think along the lines of Buber's I, thou, right? But such modern theistic philosophers haven't gotten that much traction in modern and postmodern thought, I believe, because philosophers and intellectuals, for the most part, have been willing to consider anything that might possibly diminish individual autonomy. But Kierkegaard's existentialism has also inspired many 20th century theologians who have been extremely influential, at least in theology, they are known as dialectical theologians. And two of the most famous are the German 20th century theologians Karl Barth and Paul Tillich. Without going into too much depth, because Barth was super prolific, Barth's theology was a reaction against the rationalizing theology of liberalism. The Bible can't be trusted. Much of the history surrounding Jesus is untrustworthy, yada, yada, yada. So what we need to do, the liberal theologians would say, is simply follow Christ's moral example. Try to be a good person. Believe in the universal fatherhood of God and the universal brotherhood of man. very, very much like deism when it comes down to it. And Barth was like, ugh. Barth's theology, by contrast, is a strong restatement of classical Protestant theology, which we studied under Christian theism, but with a difference. We can accept that the Bible is a human document full of error, he says, but the Word of God is not. And you're like, wait, I thought the Word of God, it was the Bible. No, 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 no. The Word of God is an event. It is a meeting with God that happens through the preaching of the Bible, through the Word, God, who is totaliter aliter, that is, he is totally other, through the Word, this event, which is mediated through preaching, comes to us and mysteriously meets us through this fallible Bible. And it's very much like Kierkegaard's Night of Faith, meeting God through paradox. But this time, it's the paradox of meeting an infinite God through the finite, fallible Bible. For Paul Tillich, God is the ultimate ground of being. By participating in God, man receives his own being, but he is also caught in a world of apparent absurdity, and in a world in which contains his own death, his own non-being. By courageously facing his own non-being, man expresses his ultimate concern. That's Tillich's term for religion as sort of the depth dimension of culture and art. By facing non-being, man makes himself open to Christ, who made himself transparent to the ground of being, which is God, through his sacrifice on the cross. In this way, God gives to man a new being. The way into this new being is available only through myth, and for Tillich, myth is symbols that participate in the reality to which they point. Not just stories, but somehow connect us to the spiritual reality that they're talking about. So the important point is not whether Jesus actually historically rose from the dead. Rather, his mythical rising from the dead opens us to a relationship to new life by participating in the new life that it points to, this new resurrection life, the spiritual life. But it doesn't actually matter whether Jesus rose from the dead, which makes it very different than classical Christian theology. So for Barth and Tillich, the history that the Bible tells didn't have to happen. They simply accepted the naturalistic, scientistic criticism of the Bible and yet tried to rescue Christian faith, to keep space for faith by way of Kierkegaardian paradox, the way the infinite meets the finite. All right, so that's my presentation on theistic existentialism and the impact it's had. Now, let's move on to some assessment and critique, because there's a lot to take in. There's one point I definitely agree with Kierkegaard and the others. Too often Christianity has been reduced to a set of beliefs and expected behaviors. You know, it's all about respectability, and it loses that relational aspect, the mystery of knowing an infinite God through the God-man Jesus Christ and his Spirit. In this respect, Kierkegaard's and the other theistic existentialists' efforts were understandable. Too much of Christianity has been about an I-it relationship and has lost that I-thou dimension. But there are places where I disagree with theistic existentialism. It seems to me, first of all, that theistic existentialism has gone too far in the other direction, making relationship with God and for Buber, and perhaps Marcel, relationship with other people, into a moment of transcendence devoid of content, empty of any sort of propositional truth. For theistic existentialists, saying that the Christian faith affirms certain propositional truths, that is, truths that can be expressed in words, in statements, such as God exists, or Jesus died on the cross, or Jesus rose again from the dead, thinking that the Christian faith affirms these things, that is a fundamental betrayal of the relational aspect of truth. It turns our relationship with God into an I-it, an abstract, inauthentic thing, because propositions cannot tell us everything about God. Therefore, they betray the mystery of relationship with God. And think back to Nietzsche on language. If it can't say everything, then it's necessarily lying. That's sort of a hallmark of dialectical thinking. It's all or nothing. But I counter. Relational authenticity and mystery and propositional truths and information are not necessarily enemies. When I relate to my children, and I've raised 3, even now that they are adults, I know certain propositional truths about them that are important. I know their hair color, their eye color, their likes and their dislikes, their sense of humor, their birthdays, where they struggle in life, a history of successes and failures. None of these things exhausts their being in our relationship. None of these things tells me everything I could possibly know about them. I cannot reduce their being, that is to say, to mere information. And yet, knowing that information and being able to articulate that information is vital for helping me to relate to the mysterious, wonderful people that they are. Without it, my relationship with them would be confused and directionless and uninspired. And I believe that it is the same about our relationship with God. The information that the Bible gives enriches my relationship with God rather than drains it of its mystery. Mystery incorporates information even as it surpasses mere information. And this is where I think theistic existentialism becomes somewhat unbalanced. Another point of disagreement, I disagree with theistic existentialism's starting point. They begin not with the reality of God, which is what the left picture is supposed to represent, although, you know, it's a cliche image, whatever. They don't begin with the reality of God, but rather with the individual human caught in an ambivalent situation, in the agony of decision, which is the picture on the right. That may seem to be a subtle difference, but it makes all the difference down the road. Instead of constructing a philosophy with God at the center, theistic existentialism puts the human individual at the center and adapts the worldview to that fundamental reality. And that will change the way you answer the way reality be. For example, are we caught in an absurd situation? Well, that depends on whether or not one starts with God or man. Can God meet us in a way that is understandable to us, or must it be through this shattering paradox? Does God have the power to pull it off? And your answer will differ depending on whether you start with God, who can do anything, or with man, who has a really hard time wrapping his head around eternity and infinitude. The starting point, I would say, of theistic existentialism is at odds with what is given to us in the Bible, even as it uses the Bible to show what authentic existence is like. So, given those two problems, a man-centered starting point and a deep distrust of propositional truth, theistic existentialism can leave you with a faith that has no content, or only has absurd content. Think of the Knight of Faith, right? And that kind of contentless, paradoxical relationship with God provides very little resistance for later thinkers like Sartre to get rid of God altogether. In other words, theistic existentialist thinkers like Kierkegaard leave the door wide open for later atheistic existentialist thinkers like Sartre. And that's what we're going to be dealing with in our next video. Furthermore, this radical individualism, this inwardness, as Kierkegaard calls it, tends to shun community. The Knight of Faith must walk alone, right? Without a universal ethic, which gets suspended in the teleological suspension of the ethical, right? If you just assume that you're a Knight of Faith and you can suspend the ethical whenever you think God's talking to you to do something unethical, immoral abuses, hurting each other, abusing each other, that will remain a problem. Did Kierkegaard not confess to Regina the truth out of a concern for her, or because of his own pride and shame? It seems that the Knight of Faith route could have been a convenient way out for him out of this hard situation that he found himself in. I think it would have been better to tell her and ask for forgiveness. After all, I've heard that forgiveness is something that Christians do. Much later, theistic existentialism really became a way to accommodate the liberal criticism of the Bible, that it can't be trusted. It's a human document. It's not the Word of God. Miracles don't happen, blah, 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 blah. Instead of challenging the presuppositions, the materialistic, naturalistic, scientific presuppositions that inform modern criticism, namely naturalism, anti-supernaturalism, and so forth. For example, one of the German dialectical theologians is a guy named Rudolf Bultmann. And Bultmann, in one of his books, said very famously, "In the age of the light bulb, can we really believe that someone rose from the dead?" And the implication is, of course, you'd have to be an idiot in a scientific age to believe that somebody could rise from the dead. And in this way, theistic existentialism is actually way too accommodating, and it undermines the presuppositions of Christian theism, namely that God controls history and can intervene into histories that in ways that we can't understand, that don't fit well with natural scientific law. He can suspend those when he wishes. In other words, if we take a Christian theistic perspective on it, yeah, even in the age of the light bulb, we really believe that God can raise the dead. So that's all I got to say about theistic existentialism. Thank you for listening. I know it was a long one, but I wanted to get the critiques in there as well. On the atheistic existentialism video, I will not do the critiques because we'll do them in class. Unless maybe we run out of time because the semester is going fast. Anyway, have a great rest of your week, and I will see you guys when we get back into class. Thank you for listening. And for those of you who are not in my class, thank you again for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. See ya. Bye-bye.